This conference will now be recorded.
All right, we got that going. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Moon. I'm with O2 Compost, and I will be working with the Athens, Clarke County landfill folks, solid waste folks, to help conduct a pilot project where we're going to be utilizing aerated static pile composting. And the objective of this webinar is to do an introduction and overview of what is aerated static pile composting and discuss some of the principles and objectives so that we can conduct a pilot project prior to a workshop that we will be conducting this October. So with that, we'll get started. No, I'm not. Okay. The objective of composting in general is to convert raw feedstock materials into high quality soil amendments, what we call compost. And we do this in a way that utilizes a technology that's referred to as aerated static pile composting. And we're going to be talking a great deal about that. In this picture, what you're seeing is a large pile, probably 40, 50 cubic yards of material. Looks like a big meatloaf sitting out on the ground there. It's got pipe underneath it, some solid, some perforated pipe, which is connected to an aeration manifold. And then in the doghouse, we have an electric blower, which pushes air into the pile. And that blower is controlled by a timer, cycle timer. So what are we going to accomplish with this webinar? It's an introduction and overview. We'll talk about what is aerated static pile composting. We'll take a virtual tour of a few of the compost facilities that I've been involved with over the years. And we'll talk about the secret of aerated composting. And then we'll look at how do we take action, because when we take action, I think for most of us, doing something helps us understand what it is we're doing and why it works the way it does. In that regard, we'll talk briefly about composting as a manufacturing process, and we'll look at the benefits of conducting an ASP pilot project. Oops, having trouble with my down arrow here. What is aerated static pile composting, or ASP composting? With ASP composting, we construct a compost pile over a simple network of aeration pipes and induce airflow into the pile using an electric blower. That blower is controlled by a timer. We do not turn the pile during the first 21 to 30 days of composting, what we refer to as the active phase of composting. This is where we're getting most of the heat generation. To control or manage the composting process, we adjust the airflow, and by doing so, we can manage pile temperatures and optimize the biology of the composting process. And we operate a blower using either grid power or solar power, and I have one solar example that I'll show you as we go. On the very smallest scale, my company offers something that we call a microbin system, and this is two examples of that. The left is a simple plywood box, a little quarter horsepower blower that delivers air into a two-pipe manifold. And then on the right, it's exactly the same thing. It's just a little nicer looking box, a little sturdier, that is constructed using tongue and groove lumber. Slightly larger system. This is in Columbus, North Carolina. 3-bin system built into the hillside. Again, the blower delivers airflow into any one or combination of the bins using a simple push-pull gate valve system that allows air to come up through an aeration plenum box in the base of the each of those bins. Another example, again, somewhat larger here, this one with a roof on it in Sterling, Massachusetts. This is the solar example that I mentioned. This is what we call a block bay or an aerated block bay system. This is at a high school in Ojai, California, where the resident students each have a horse, and they're composting all the horse manure, stall bedding, food waste that comes out of the cafeteria, and the landscaping waste that is generated on the property. That's been a very successful project. I just spoke with them. And if you recall last year where we had in California huge fires, wildfires, this property was spared, but they had fire on 3 sides. So it was a miracle that they came out of this without burning down. Here's an example of a very simple freestanding aerated static pile. It's a 4-pipe pile. The blower sits on the other end. You don't see it in this picture. And we do like to have the pipes sticking out of the end of the pile for 2 reasons. One, if water does happen to get into the pipes, we can pull the caps, turn on the blower, and push all the water out. And the second reason is when we come to breaking down the pile, it's really helpful for the operator sitting on the loader to know where that pipe is. In this particular case, we're using thin wall pipe, and we would tend to come in and scalp the pile off the top of the pipe and then manhandle the pipe out from underneath it. Let's see if we got this example here. This is what we refer to as an extended aerated static pile. This is a project that's probably been operating 15 years or more in Pennsylvania. And in this case, we are constructing new cells on new pipe as it's being added, making the pile progressively wider as we go. As you see, there's 3 blowers in this case, each feeding air into a 6-pipe manifold. So there's 18 pipes here. The manifold itself is PVC, and then we have a short length of flex tubing that connects to black pipe. And I'm sure you're familiar at the landfill of using thick wall HDPE pipe. That's what we use in permanent systems where we have a pipe on grade. In this case, what my client does is wrap a chain around the pipe when he's getting ready to break it down and take his loader and literally pull it out from underneath the pile, and then he breaks the pile down. So the importance of aeration, by inducing airflow into the compost pile, we're able to maintain aerobic conditions without turning the pile. And this is a very, very important thing for many reasons that we'll discuss later on in the presentation. By maintaining aerobic conditions, we're able to optimize the biology of the composting process and, to a degree, manage pile temperatures within that pile. By doing all of that, we reduce offensive odors and hence neighbor complaints, and we greatly expedite the rate of composting as a means of producing a high-quality compost product in considerably less time. So taking a look at what is an aerated static pile, this is an isometric view showing a 2-pipe system. And we assume that the side is about a 1-to-1 slope. And the rule of thumb that we use when we're using 4-inch diameter pipe is a maximum pile length of about 75 to 80 feet. So taking a look at that same image from a bird's eye point of view or a plan view, the outer rectangle is where the pile comes in contact with the ground. The inner rectangle is the top of the pile, and then the diagonals represent the slopes on the 4 sides of the pile. The red line is a section line, imaginary section line, that if we were to take a slice and remove the section from the left and then look at it from the ground view, this is what we would see. So in this example, we're going to be using a pipe-on-grade system shown in red. We can use thin wall pipe for a pilot test, but as I mentioned, for an ongoing system, we like to use thick wall HDPE because it's virtually indestructible. In some cases, we also construct trenches in a concrete slab, and if we do this, they work great, but we need to plan for aeration, but also for drainage. Those have to be plumbed to a sump to collect any excess water that might collect in those. But for this example, we're going to stick with a pipe-on-grade system. Over the top of the pipe, we place a layer of wood chips, or in some cases screen overs, or the coarse material that comes off the end of the screen, and put that over the pipe. And the objective here is to give the air a place to go so that it is distributed evenly across the base of the pile, both left to right and front to back, or upstream, downstream. It's key to have uniform airflow up and into that mix. So we have a mix that sits over the top of the plenum material. This is really a critical component to any compost system, but in particular for aerated static pile composting. And we take a look at the nutrient balance, or what is oftentimes referred to as the carbon to nitrogen ratio. We look at the bulk density of the material, or the unit weight per given volume. And this is an indirect way to understand the porosity of the material so that we can ensure airflow up and through. And then the third component is moisture content. And of the three, moisture content is really the critical component. Our objective here is to have a mix that starts out at 60 to 65% moisture content. Over the top of the mix, we place what we call as a biofilter cover layer. I typically recommend using unscreened compost for this purpose, and we'll talk about why we're using compost a little later in the presentation. But the biofilter cover is really an extremely important component of the aerated static pile method. The first reason is that it serves as an insulating layer so that all of the mix can achieve temperatures such that we achieve a process to further reduce pathogens. This may be a term that you're familiar with, but what we want to do is effectively reduce the pathogen count in the compost material such that it's safe for anyone to use in any application. The second reason is equally important, as it acts as a biofilter. In this case, the outer layer will absorb any of the volatile organic compounds or the odorous gases, most of which we experience as odor, and it'll absorb those compounds in the matrix of that biofilter layer, and the microbes that reside there will consume them, such that what comes off the top of the pile is a very, very mild, I describe it as a friendly organic fragrance comes off the top of the pile. It also helps to retain nutrients. The biofilter is very effective at absorbing ammonia gas, and ammonia is a nitrogenous gas, so we're retaining nitrogen in the system, which helps with product quality and product sales. It also serves as a vector barrier such that if we're composting food waste, wildlife, birds, that sort of thing won't be inclined to dig through it, because if they get a few inches down in it, it gets just too hot for them to go any further. And any fly larvae that might be in the mix will certainly cook and not emerge to create a fly problem. Also helps to retain moisture in the system. The core of the pile can dry out if we're not careful with aeration, and so in very dry climates, we will typically irrigate the top of the pile, keeping it quite wet, and thereby retaining moisture in the mix of the pile. Plus, it also helps with aesthetics, which is probably the least important in terms of functionality, but one of the most important factors when it comes to neighborhood approval of what you're doing. So this is an example of a partially constructed aerated static pile. This is one that we did at a series of workshops that I conducted here in our hometown, Snohomish, Washington. And this is when we get to constructing a pile there at the landfill, the process that we will go through. But you can see the timer box, which controls the blower, and the blower that feeds air into the manifold, delivering it to the 4 pipes. The area of pipe that is covered with the wood chips is the perforated section. The areas that are not covered with wood chips, those are solid pipe. And I'll explain here in a minute why we do it that way. And then to the left, on the 2 pipes that are on the left side, we have the shredded yard waste material. And in this picture, we have not started putting on the biofilter cover yet. So this is a time lapse. This is a project I worked on in a city called Walla Walla in Washington, eastern Washington. And they had been doing more or less a turned Windrow system for quite some time, and they've asked me to help them convert to an aerated static pile system. And so when we went out and did a pilot project, I took this series of pictures and then produced a time-lapse video. So we'll go ahead and watch this. It takes under 2 minutes, and I'll kind of describe it as we go. Here, let's get that started. So here we are getting everything set up, pulling out the pipe. I like to set up the entire pipe network and manifold system just to make sure that we have everything that we need when we need it. It's really a pain in the neck to go to the hardware store in the last minute because you forgot a T or an elbow or caps or something along those lines. So here what you're seeing is we're constructing all 4 pipes, and then we're going to remove 2 of the pipes off to the side so that we can add those later. At this point, we're putting the aeration plenum, these are screen overs, over the top of the pile, and now we're placing the freshly ground green waste over the top of that. You can see the truck is adding water as we go. It's quite dry in eastern Washington, and so we added about 2,500 cubic yards, 2,500 gallons of water as we built the pile. So you've seen now that we've added the 3rd pipe. We're getting ready to add the 4th pipe here in a second. And I think what he's doing right now is he's reaching over the top and adding the biofilter cover on the back side of that pile. So now we have the 4th pipe in, the plenum on top, more material that's being added, watering it as we go, and here shortly you'll see he'll put the final cover on the front side, and then we'll be done. There's the cover. All of this took about 4.5, 5 hours to complete. And so what you just saw there is what we're going to be doing at the landfill here shortly. Okay, so, let's go on. Sorry, there we go. So if you look at what we just saw as being a freestanding aerated static pile, we can also construct what's referred to as an extended aerated static pile, and I showed you an example of that earlier, so that when the pile tows out and we're going to add, we add a pipe and we add a pipe. In the example that I showed you in the time-lapse video, we had 4 pipes. Those 4 pipes received air from a single blower. But we can continue to add pipe as we go to the right, and if we have another 4-pipe system, that would form its second zone. So in this case, there are 4 pipes to a zone, and we can make it as long as we want. This is an example of a project that I worked on back in the early 1990s in Napa, California, or Rutherford, California, in the Napa Valley. And this is grape pumice. This is a project where they bring in grape pumice from all the wineries in the valley, and they construct these piles. In this case, each pile has 10 blowers, so you're seeing 2 piles and the alleyway in between. On the left pile, it measures about 100 feet from left to right, which is longer than what I would recommend. If you recall, I said that 75 to 80 is what we try to stay with. In foreground to background, that pile measures about 550 feet in length. It started out about 12 feet in height, and there's about 25,000 cubic yards in each of these two piles. So you can see it's quite expandable. So the benefits of aerated static pile composting is we're able to reduce the footprint of the active compost pad, typically 4 to 5 times the volume per square foot of available space with this method. We're by increasing the capacity as well as the throughput of a given facility, because we're really achieving most of what we're trying to do with composting in the first 30 to, let's say, 45 days. We reduce the cost of processing because there's less equipment time, less labor, and certainly less fuel for that equipment. We are able to resolve offsite odor impacts and neighbor complaints. A lot of what I do on the consulting side of my business is to help existing compost facilities resolve odor issues and neighbor impacts. We're able to process more challenging feedstocks, such things as food waste, biosolids, animal mortalities, things that are otherwise very, very challenging to work with. And in the end, improve product quality and ultimately increase the selling price on that product. So let's take a quick virtual tour of a few aerated static pile compost facilities. These are freestanding aerated static piles at an organic farm in New Jersey. These are quite long, and they, as you can see, he's decided to build them sequentially, not as an extended pile. In this case, this is an extended pile. It's got 4 blowers, each 5 horsepower, delivering air into a 6-pipe manifold system. The pile measures about 80 feet by 140 feet, started out about 12 feet tall, and in this pile there's about 3,500 cubic yards of material. On a somewhat smaller scale, this is a project with a 4-bin system in Montana. This is built into the hillside, so when they come out of the barn with horse manure and stall bedding, they can simply dump it in from the top side, and then the blower sits at the far end, and when time comes to break down the pile, they open the gates and pull it out from the lower side of that structure. In this case, we have the aeration channels that are built into the concrete slab rather than a pipe-on-grade system. Here's a couple more examples of bin systems. The one in Cooperstown, New York. This is the owner of the Baseball Hall of Fame, in fact, and they have 2 restaurants that they take the food waste out of, and all of that food waste is composted in that structure. And then on the right side, this is a project in Vermont where they're composting horse manure. And I put this picture in just to show that even in extreme cold climates, we're able to compost quite effectively year-round. Somewhat larger system out on Long Island in New York. These are quite large bays. I put this picture in because most people think when they hear composting that you need to turn the pile. And you're probably familiar with this. I know that you have a turned Windrow system out there. I don't know what kind of equipment that you're using. This is a Straddle type Windrow machine. And on a somewhat smaller scale, you can use tow behind, PTO driven and such. I showed you earlier of the Great Pumice project. This is pictures when we were doing the pilot project. They were doing turned Windrows, but they were having a lot of trouble with capacity and with odors and neighbor impacts. And so we converted that system into an extended aerated static pile system that again resulted in this operation here. And we're right now entering into the start of the harvest season in the Napa-Sonoma Valley. And so right today, this pad is absolutely clear, but come mid-September, late September, they will start building these piles and doing it all again. This is an annual batch process as opposed to a flow-through process. So we'll take a minute and talk about the secret to aerated composting, starting with a definition of composting. Or there's many definitions, but a simple one that I like to use is the transformation of raw organic materials into biologically stable, humus-rich substances suitable for growing plants. Now, our objective is that it needs to be a safe product so that when grandma is out there and doing her gardening and her 2-year-old grandson is playing in the dirt, that he doesn't get sick with E. coli or salmonella or such. So safety is really our number one goal. So this is a simple schematic of what is the composting process. On the left side, we have raw organic materials. They can take many, many shapes: food waste, yard waste, biosolids, mortalities. I'm working on a project where we're composting whole fish. There are minerals, water, and certainly the microorganisms that are already in the feedstocks themselves. It's a very, very rare instance where we need to add anything to any powders or any biologically active materials to really initiate the composting process. So step one, we prepare the mix and build the pile, in this case just a freestanding pile. Step number two, we're adding oxygen to the system, and the byproducts of the composting process when we maintain aerobic conditions are water, heat, and carbon dioxide. We utilize the heat to destroy pathogens, parasites, and weed seeds in the mix. And of course, this does take some time. If anybody comes to you and say, we've got a magic system or a magic solution to reduce the time to 2 or 3 days, they either don't understand the biology of the composting process, or they're just trying to sell you something. After a period of time, we result with stable organic matter. We've reduced the raw organic feedstocks to more of a humus-like material. That includes minerals. It certainly will need to be somewhat wet, and the microbes that are very, very beneficial to adding back into the soil. So this is the process in general. And the secret to composting is oxygen. Without oxygen, it slows the process down, and I'll talk a little more about that here in a second. So this is a graph that shows what happens when we start with the blower running. The air that we breathe at sea level is slightly over 20% oxygen. In the compost pile, you're typically going to be at the 18%, maybe a little bit higher. And when the blower turns off, or when the windrow turner stops turning and getting air in the system, the microorganisms very, very quickly consume that oxygen, such that within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, depending on what we're composting, the oxygen level can drop down to as low as 1 or 2%. If we're much below 10%, some people say 8 to 10% is the zone at which we go from aerobic to anaerobic conditions. When we get anaerobic, it slows the process down. The gases that come off of the material we experience as strong odors, if not absolutely offensive odors, and that's where we get into trouble. And so our objective is to stay above this line, and we do that by setting the timer on the blower to induce airflow every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes, depending on what we're composting and how long that material has been composting. So with aeration, it allows the operator to maintain aerobic conditions, mitigate impacts from objectionable odors, manage pile temperatures, reduce the loss of nutrients, facilitate the rate of composting and curing, which is a secondary process following active composting, and produce superior compost products. With regard to the mix, there are 4 critical parameters that we're shooting for. The first is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. C to N, we're shooting for something around 30 to 1. This is determined through lab tests that we can run, but ultimately it becomes a decision that the operator makes simply by looking at the mix of materials. The nitrogenous materials are those that are green typically. So we've got grass, high nitrogen, manure tends to be high nitrogen, food waste, biosolids. These things need to have a carbon companion for two reasons. One, for the biology to take place, we need available carbon, but the carbon typically comes in the form of wood chips or shredded tree limbs, things of that nature that are more resilient. And the equally important reason for adding those to the mix is that it creates porosity. And we measure porosity as the volume of void space. And to get there, we look at the bulk density of the material. Our goal is to have a bulk density of somewhere between 550 to 950 pounds per cubic yard. Now, how do you measure that? That's a pretty tough thing to do. And so we have what we call a bucket test, where we use a 5-gallon bucket. And this is one of the things that I'll be demonstrating and that everybody who attends the workshop will get a hands on to be able to do. So it's really quite a simple thing to measure the weight of a bucket and just relate that to the bulk density as 550 to 950 pounds per cubic yard. We're also going to look at the airspace, which is a measure of the voids in the mix, and all of that is done when we have prepared a mix at a moisture content that is between 60 and 65%. A way to test that is if you take 100 grams of whatever your mix is and dry it out in an oven. I typically use a toaster oven to do this at a low temperature. And that 100 grams, when the material is dry, leaves you with a residue that weighs 40 grams. We have lost 60 grams of something, which in this case is water, and that represents a moisture content of 60%. So that's the concept of moisture content. And the fourth factor, which is something that we really don't look at in most cases, but for me this last year became a very, very important factor, is the pH, or the level of acidity. We're shooting for a pH of 6.5 to 7, although we can tolerate a little lower or a little higher. But once we get much below 5, where it gets quite acidic, it really impedes the population growth and development of the bacteria that are doing the composting for us. And so we have to go to kind of extreme situation to resolve that pH problem. We can add lime, that's one solution, but another is to slowly induce airflow at a constant rate over an extended period of time to help digest the organic acids and get that pH to come up, at which point then the bacteria take off. So pH is probably, it's number 4 for a reason. It's probably the least of my concerns, but occasionally it does show up as a factor, especially when we're dealing with old food waste. Okay, so if you want to take a screenshot of this slide, this is probably the core information for preparing a good compost mix. And I'm not going to go through each one of these point by point, but for each parameter on the left, we have a reasonable range, and then we have a preferred range for the aerated static pile method of composting. Let's take a minute and talk about the life cycle of a compost pile. This may involve some language that you're not altogether familiar with, but it's really quite simple concept. We have the area, the A zone, what we call the mesophilic zone. Mesophilic is a word that simply means that we're below about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. We then go into this B zone, what we call the thermophilic zone, where we're above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you see this line at 131 degrees Fahrenheit and PFRP. PFRP is a term that means a process to further reduce pathogens. And with aerated static pile composting, and because we have the biofilter cover or the insulative cover over the top of the pile, the criteria for meeting PFRP are 131 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 3 days, and it does not involve any turning. In most cases, this is fairly easy to accomplish. Now, you may ask yourself, why 131 degrees? That's kind of a weird number. Actually, that's just the conversion of 55 degrees Celsius. And so 131 for 3 days is ultimately our goal. And you can see there's a line here at 155 degrees, which is really getting close to our upper threshold for where we want the pile temperature to be in the pile. In this case, we're probably up around 165 degrees, and somewhere in here we're really beginning to impede the type of biology in the system. And if we're much higher than that, our population of microorganisms goes way, way down, and as a result, our composting process becomes very, very inefficient. The second reason that we want to keep the pile temperatures down around 155 or maybe somewhat less is that we're less inclined to drive off the volatile organic compounds and create odor issues. So on the left side of this dashed line, zones A and B, we refer to this as active composting, and this is mostly a bacterial-driven process. To the right of the dashed line, we are now in the curing mode, and this is more of a fungal-driven process. And I put a dash line in here because it's really not a definitive point in time, but rather a transition. So it's a concept that we're working with, active composting versus curing. And to a degree, it's a function of pile temperature. Now, in terms of this curve, you can see it's going up, it tops out for a period of time, and then it comes down. And this is a fairly normal occurrence with composting as it gets older and the food value of the mix decreases. It's been consumed. There's less and less biologic activity. The temperature, the heat in the pile actually dissipates to the environment and the pile temperature comes down. So looking at real data, what we see here is this pile is constructed. We induce airflow into the mix, and almost immediately we see a huge temperature gain. And it's not at all unusual to see 40, 50, 60 degree temperature gain in a matter of hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, certainly. And then in this case, we were taking temperature readings using data loggers, and so that's why the temperatures are so squiggly here. It's the diurnal change or the daily night-to-day change in the system. But it came up, came down, and at some point I just plugged in a vertical dash line and said, okay, to the left of that is active composting, to the right of that is curing and maturation. But in fact, as I said, this is really a transition. It's not a definitive point in time. So now that we know a little of the science, and believe me, there's a lot more to it than just that, but we'll leave that as an introduction here. We're going to look at the manufacturing process, composting as a manufacturing process. And in this flow diagram, we start up here in the upper left, and this is really for people who are just getting into the composting business or the process, and they're saying, okay, what do we want to achieve? So they begin with the end in mind, which is one of the 7 habits from a book by Stephen Covey back in 1993. But we want to envision, what is this thing going to be, and why are we doing it, and Are we trying to make money, or are we trying to defer costs, or what are our objectives here? And in that decision-making process, we're looking at what are type of recipes, what kind of feedstocks we're going to be using, how do we acquire those feedstocks, what kind of amendments or bulking materials do we need, where are we going to get those, so forth. We prepare the initial mix, active compost process, which is largely what we're going to be doing in the pilot project, which then leads to curing. If you're going to be selling the product, typically you're going to screen it. To produce your product, you test it. When you screen it, the screen overs will typically go back to the beginning and become part of the mix in the next batch or two batches down the road. Product refinement, we can blend it, we can bag it, temporary storage, go through delivery, how are we going to get it to market, and all the while looking at what is going on. We're making observations, we're doing survey of our clients, we're making whatever adjustments we need to make for this process to work. So I think of the flow chart as a monopoly game where we've got lots of pieces of moving parts, and everything is continually flowing through the system. We're not doing one thing at a time. Rather, we're doing all things at all times. And so we have to kind of keep this in mind to look for where are the inefficiencies, where are the constraints in the system, and always working to resolve those constraints. So when the method of mixing and processing is successful at meeting the biologic requirements of composting, our primary focus becomes material handling. How do we do this most efficiently? Composting is a manufacturing process, and the objective should always be to produce the highest quality product that you can. And this is kind of a magical statement from the standpoint that when we look at how do I produce the best finished product, all of the other factors kind of come into focus. What kind of screen do I use? What kind of grinder do I use? What kind of front-end loader? How do I manage surface water without cross-contamination? How do I eliminate odor impacts to neighbors? All of these things are related to one degree or another to product quality. So with any composting system, your method will evolve over time. So here are a few recommendations. I like to recommend starting small and growing in planned increments. In the case of a turned windrow compost facility, we don't make a sudden change where one day we're doing turned windrows and the second day we're doing aerated static piles. It doesn't work that way. We start with a pilot project. Everybody becomes comfortable with that method. We ask all the questions. We answer those. We resolve logistical constraints, and then we slowly but surely transition to adjust the method of composting. We like to define our key objectives and set goals. What are we trying to do here? We always strive to improve product quality, as I said just a moment ago. We always work to reduce materials handling. Time is money, equipment time, fuel, all of those things. If we can reduce that, we're reducing the cost of operation. We're looking to manage constraints in the system. If we have a screen that's too small and that's our bottleneck, let's get another screen, or maybe hire a screen in during peak flow season. We always want to respond to regulatory changes and be on top of that, be proactive in that regard. We want to be a good neighbor and ultimately want to keep it simple. We also want to manage the compost facility based on a continuous, variable flow of materials. And this is a key thing for handling raw feedstocks promptly. If we are receiving food waste, for example, and we allow it to sit around for any length of time, we're certainly going to have problems with odors and vectors. We have to have policies in place that no raw feedstocks sit unattended overnight or for any length of time. We pay particular attention to the aeration of the system and the amount of moisture in the system, as again, moisture is critical to the process. We don't lose sight of the big picture, manage the site by practicing good housekeeping techniques. We don't have projects sitting around unfinished. We don't have garbage. We don't have broken equipment or old equipment that we have a bone pile out back. We clean all that up and get it out of there. And again, can't stress this enough, we always strive to improve product quality. So conducting a pilot project, what are the 4 stages of learning? This is kind of fun. We have unconscious incompetence, conscious competence, conscious incompetence, and unconscious competence. So what does that mean? We don't know what we don't know. This is for the rank beginner. They want to get into composting, but they just don't know how to get started. And believe me, there are a lot of folks out there who want to get into composting. I work with them every day, and it's amazing to me that they have this idea of, and it's a great idea, to convert raw organic material into a finished product that they can sell, but they have no experience, they have no knowledge as to where to get started. So with conscious competence, we've been doing some studying, or we've taken a class, or we've gotten our hands dirty and done some pilot work, and now we know what we know. Okay, when we prepare a mix this way and when we induce airflow at this rate, we get these temperatures, we get this finished product. I believe it works because I've done it. Now I know what I know. But as you go along, you'll find out that there's stuff you don't know. Maybe you go to a conference and you're sitting in some classes and you go, man, these guys have been around for 30 years. They really know what's going on, and I'd never given that any thought. So you become aware that there's more to it than meets the eye, and there's more to it than just your experience allows for. And then you get to the point ultimately where you've been doing this for quite a while. It works quite well. People say, how do you know all this? You say, I don't know. I've just been doing it a long time. And that's where we want to get with any of these projects, where you don't know what you know, but you know it. So learning by doing. I showed you a picture of this pile on the left side, partially constructed, the finished pile on the right. You've got to get your hands dirty to understand it. So I refer to it as bridging the gap between knowledge, classroom knowledge, and understanding. That's where you get in the field. That's how you understand what's going on. So we can do this in 2 ways. We can do small volume pilot projects. Here's, again, a picture of our microbin system. And with this approach, it's quick and inexpensive to construct and start up. We can prototype various mixes. Let's say we're working with chicken offal, and we're just not sure how to mix this together, so we can do some prototype mixing and test it. Quick turnaround, looking at the C to N, bulk density, moisture content of the mix, and confirm the suitability of that particular recipe before we go to setting up a larger pile. This also is an opportunity if people are in doubt of what you're trying to do, and then we run into this in a university setting quite often, where somebody or a group of people want to do food waste composting, but the administration says, I'm not so sure I want to do this. We can do that. We can set up a small-scale pilot project. It's got a definitive beginning and an end. It's cheap to put together. And when they come out and they see that, man, this is hot and it doesn't stink and there are no flies, there are no rats, this is an opportunity you can convey fairly quickly to the stakeholders and get their buy-in in the process. On a somewhat larger scale, there are those same opportunities and more. We can provide operator training so that the operators have a complete understanding of what our goals and objectives are. Resolve logistical constraints. This is really key to the pilot project process. And this is one that really didn't come to mind until we ran into, where do we get bulking material? Or where are we going to do it? And what about power? What about a source of water? Well, what kind of loader are we going to use? Are we going to borrow a loader, or are we going to buy a loader? Who's going to bring it in? Who's going to bring the feedstocks in? How are we going to deliver the finished product? There's innumerable logistical constraints that you cannot anticipate until you start the pilot project and they show up. And it's through resolving those logistical constraints that you get the greatest benefit out of the pilot project. With this, you can test a variety of mixes, establish standard operating procedures, an operations plan. Oftentimes, you may get permission from the local health department or the local regulators to do a pilot project as a way to really demonstrating that you can do it, one, but then also determine what are the permit requirements that are going to fall into place once we get this thing fully established, and then build regulatory compliance. And I've got a couple of examples here. Regarding logistical constraints, this is a project that I worked on in Salt Lake City. And for those of you who haven't been there, it's quite dry in the summertime. And the material that comes in is very, very carbon rich. And at that particular site, they had no power. So we put together a solar panel from a prior project that was on loan. And then we figured out a way to get the mix quite wet. But we had challenges with feedstock sources, transportation, aeration system, equipment, who was going to do it. This was a project, it was a joint project with the city and the county. And the county really didn't want to give up their operators to do the project, but they had to negotiate who was going to be doing the work. Power, water, and permits were certainly an issue on that project. Here's a second example where we were composting fish waste, and we went to the port who was the property owner, and we said, we want to do fish waste composting, and they said, no way in hell are we going to do fish waste, it stinks. And we said, wait, let us show you with a pilot project. We've been composting fish waste for 12 years now, both on the private sector and the public sector. We had buy-in with the Washington State University, so they gave us an opportunity to do a 3-month pilot project. In this case, we got it set up, and then we had an open invitation to anybody who wanted to come and see it. So we had the state, the county, the city, the port, the air quality people, and to a person, they said, if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed it was possible. And so we had the partners, investors, employees, regulators, neighbors, customers, and end users all buying into what we were trying to do. And this project is actively going on today to the point where we're marketing and selling bagged products to nurseries in Western Washington. So that's pretty much what I had put together for this part of the presentation. We can certainly go on and on and on in a number of different topics, and I want to reserve some of that for a conversation when I come there in October